Okay, great. We'll let you start.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. You're all very welcome to the Skills Needs in Ireland joint webinar being hosted by ETBI and SOLACE. I'd like to welcome our two colleagues who are with us today from SOLACE, Joan McNobe, whom you all know, the manager of the Skills and Labour Market Research Unit in SOLACE, who is joined today by Nina Burke, who's the new data analyst in the Skills and Labour Market Unit Research Unit in SOLACE. From ETBI, you have Tanya Jones, the Strategy and Policy Manager, and Sabrina Smart, who is the FET Administrator, and they will guide us through the session today. The purpose is to examine how COVID-19 has affected the Irish labour market over the last year, with a particular emphasis on the sectors, the occupation, the regions that have experienced the largest fall in employment. Also a focus on Brexit and the pandemic unemployment payment. So I'm going to pass you over for some housekeeping points from Tanya. I hope everybody enjoys the day. There'll be plenty of opportunities for questions and to receive the follow-up link to the presentation, but I'll leave that to Tanya to explain. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Fiona. These are just to outline several ways how you can interact with us. And with regards to the structure of the webinar today, we're going to hear two presentations from Joan and Nina. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers session. So if you would like to submit your questions during the presentation, you can use Q&A option or indeed a chat. And then at the end of the two presentations, we're going to have some time allocated for question and answers. And if you don't mind, please to raise your hand, and then we will be able to call you out and unmute your microphone so you can ask the question. And as I said, please during the presentation, use the Q&A option, and we will be able to address it at the end of the session. After the presentation, we will be able to upload both presentations to the digital library. And also recording of this session will be available on the digital library, and the link will be sent to you post-seminar. Enjoy the day. Enjoy the presentations, should I say. Thank you, Joan. Would you like to start?
Yes, happily. So just first to thank Fiona, Tanya and Sabrina for having us with this webinar and giving us the opportunity to talk you through some of the information that we have on how the labour market is massively changing. Oh, it's gone. It's already always starts. So just as an introduction to start with, as Fiona mentioned, I'm Joan McNaboe. We're in myself and Nina Burke are in the Skills and Labour Market Research Unit. And our job is to gather and analyse data in relation to the labour market. So, you know, as you can imagine, it's been quite an interesting year for us. So hopefully we want to share as much of the information that we've gathered as we can with you today. So what we're going to cover in terms of skills needs, firstly, we're looking at the effect of COVID-19 on the labour market and looking at the employment data. What can that tell us in terms of the sectors that have been most impacted, and what can't it tell us? And this is where we will use the pandemic unemployment payments just to kind of bridge that gap where the employment data isn't showing us what we need to know. We're then going to look at who has been most impacted as a result of COVID-19. So what occupations and who's employed in these occupations. And obviously going forward now, obviously COVID is going to have an impact, but what are the other areas that are going to impact future skills needs? So we're going to look at Brexit, we're going to look at automation risks, and we're going to look at climate change. And then kind of summarizing all that we've looked through, looking at what skills challenges we face. And then I'm going to hand over to Nina, who's going to look at the regional information that we gather and give an overview on that. As I said, the presentations will be available. So I know I'm going to be showing you an awful lot of data. So it will be available later for you to sift through as well. So if we look first at the employment and unemployment data. So at the end of 2020, employment stood at 2.3 million. Unemployment stood at 138,000 and the unemployment rate was at 5.7%. So these are all the traditional ways of measuring employment in Ireland using international standards. But obviously these standards, when they were set, didn't take account of a pandemic hitting. So the CSO have attempted to kind of give an adjustment to that. So using the pandemic unemployment payments to see where we're at, they would measure the employment to stand at 1.97 million at the end of the year, unemployment at 468,000, and the unemployment rate at 19.4%. So they're both, one is an underestimation and one is an overestimation. So really it's kind of somewhere in between those points, because we would assume when things start reopening that an awful lot of people on pandemic unemployment payments will return to work. So we would see it as somewhere in between, and we're looking at probably an unemployment rate of about 12%. So if we look at employment change over the last year, so again, if we look at the standard traditional way of measuring employment, it looks like it fell by 55,000 over the year. But if we look at the COVID adjusted measure, we're looking at 400,000. So the data that I'm going to show you over the next few slides relates to this 55,000. So we don't have the breakdown for the 400,000 fall. We have the breakdown for the 55,000. So we have to keep in mind that there is going to be issues with what I'm sharing. I'm then going to show you the pandemic unemployment data, so that'll bridge that gap somewhat, hopefully. So we can see from the sectoral data at the end of 2020, the wholesale and retail sector still accounted for the highest number of people employed at over 300,000, followed by industry and health. You can see just halfway through, I've just pointed out construction and accommodation food sectors, because they would be two of the sectors that we know have been particularly impacted by COVID. So at the end of 2020, the construction sector stood at 136,000 and the accommodation and food sector at 133. So again, so what I'm talking about here is this fall of 55,000, and you can see that the accommodation food sector was by far the biggest sector decline, with 46,000 decline. The administrative and support sector fell by 30,000. So the people in this would include the likes of call centres, landscaping services, services to businesses. But where the decline is really here, we think it relates to the likes of cleaners and security staff. The other activities would include arts and entertainment, sport, so the likes of leisure centres. But again, one of the biggest falls here would be to do with hairdressers. And you can see construction sector fell by 10,000 people. And then you see at the other end of it, there's actually, despite all these declines, some sectors did actually experience increases over this time. So you can see the wholesale and retail sector did actually see an increase over this period, as did the financial sector, the IT sector, and industry. But we also need to be aware that there's a lot happening in the sectors at the moment, and really we don't know how this is going to play out over the next year. One of the main things we really notice with the COVID-19 is the impact is not the same as a recession 10 years ago. Is it 10 years ago? What we're seeing here is it's the lower skilled occupations that have been impacted most severely. So you can see that the higher skilled, the professionals, associate professionals, had an increase over the year. And then there was falls for all, so this is kind of graded depending on the level of skill required. So in terms of skills trades, the decline would have related to the likes of people in construction and chefs. Personal services would be related to care workers, childcare, and hairdressers would be in there. Sales would be retail sales assistants. Operatives, the fall of 7.7%. We'd see a lot of that being drivers, particularly taxi drivers. And then you see a fall of 16% for elementary occupations. So included in this would be hospitality occupations like waiters, bar staff, kitchen assistants. You'd also have the likes of cleaners in here. So you can see that the level of skill. So really, if ever FET had a role to play, it's very much in the COVID crisis. If you look at the level of education as well, you see that the largest percentage fall was for those who hold lower secondary or less education, accounting for about 35,000 people. There was the fall for those who hold the equivalent of the Leaving Cert and FET was about 8%, and this is 75,000 people. And despite all this fall in employment, you see that the third level increased by almost 50,000 people. The number of people in employment who held third level qualifications increased. So if we move on to the pandemic unemployment payment, just to get more of a sense of what's actually going on in the labour market at the moment. So you know that there was, in April 2020, we had up to 600,000 people in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment. And you can see that if we look firstly at the under 25s, there was over 100,000 people at the peak claiming PUP payments. Now, we do know from the DSP that approximately a third of the people under 25s who are in receipt of PUP were in full-time education when they registered for the payment. Still, though, there's still the other 2/3 is still a striking figure. You can see there was a fall in the summer months, and the amount increased again. When we look at those aged 25 years and above, you can see there was a really large gap in April 2020, and the fact that the construction sector were included in this would have had quite a significant factor here. When the construction, the retail and accommodation food started reopening, you can see there was a fall in the number of people over 25 claiming PUP. And then this increased, and there was a sharp increase there again at the end of the year into the start of 2021. If we look at the payments by gender, again, the construction sector is having an impact here. So there was a large gap between the males and females in April, with 344,000 claiming PUP in April 20. As restrictions eased, you can see that the fall happened for both genders. And by October, November, the number of females outnumbered the number of males claiming PUP. When the latest restrictions happened, again, the construction sector closed, which saw the number of males receiving PUP increasing. So if we look just at the kind of top 5 sectors that have been of people who are claiming PUP. If we just look at the top 3 first, you can see first, if we look at accommodation food, that's the purple sign. You can see, so at the start of the restrictions, there was 120,000 people from the accommodation food sector claiming PUP. And we need to remember at the start of the year, there was 180,000 people employed in this sector. So of the 180,000, 120,000 were claiming PUP. And then there was obviously people claiming the TWSS payment too through revenue. As the restrictions, you can see for the 3 sectors here, as the restrictions eased, all 3 sectors saw an increase, and you can actually map the 3 different lockdowns happening in these 3 sectors. But you can see for the wholesale and retail and for accommodation food, you can see that the numbers claiming in the start of this year did not reach the peak that they reached at the start of April. So it's about over 90,000 claiming accommodation for PUP from the accommodation food sector in February. There was an additional 60,000 claiming the EWSS from revenue. So between the two, over 150,000 people from the accommodation food sector were claiming PUP. For the wholesale and retail sector, it is lower than previous years, the peak, sorry, in April. And then you see for the arts and entertainment sector that this was, again, the hairdressers were one of the slower to reopen. It was July before they reopened. So their recovery took a little bit longer to start, but they have again been following through the different restrictions. If we then look at the construction sector, you can see that the construction sector ignored the middle lockdown because there was no impact on employment in the construction sector. So it was at over 50,000 at the start of the restrictions. Even when the whole construction sector reopened, there was still over 10,000 people claiming PUP from the construction sector. And then we see again in the start of the year when the construction sites closed that the numbers claiming increased. But again, the construction sector has about 150,000 people employed. So this represents a smaller share as compared to, say, the accommodation food sector. And then finally, just the administrative and support sector. So this is a particular concern for the Dublin region. There seems to be, from the DSP, there seems to be a particular number of people who haven't been returned to work, who've been on PUP for a full year now. And I think this is primarily related to cleaners and security staff who service businesses that haven't reopened over the last year. And you can see that the numbers just didn't fall as much as they have in other sectors, and they have kind of continued at a reasonably high level over the full period. So this brings us to so if we gather all of this information together, what are the occupations that have been impacted most significantly by COVID? So certainly in terms of volume, sales assistants have been impacted. Just to remind you, there's 135,000 people were employed as sales assistants prior to COVID. So that represents more people than are employed in the IT sector, the financial sector as a whole. So there's quite a significant number of people employed in this sector, this occupation. So hospitality occupations, we particularly see an impact on the lower skilled occupations. Between waiters and waitresses, bar staff and kitchen assistants, there was 90,000 people employed in these occupations prior to COVID. And these would account for a significant share of the fall that has happened in the sector over the last year. Cleaners, again, about 50,000 people employed as cleaners prior to COVID. And leisure and travel services, and obviously we know the impact of the travel services sector. And there's about 16,000 people employed in these occupations. So what do we know about these occupations that we've just mentioned here? Many of them are part-time workers, a much higher share than the national average. There's a high share who are female. They also have a higher share who are under 25. So we know an awful lot of students are employed in this occupation. And it's also a starter occupation for many too. We also noticed that for cleaners, waiters and kitchen assistants, they had a higher share of people who were non-Irish than the national average. So other occupations that we think have been impacted by COVID, possibly not at the same level as those other occupations, would include drivers, so taxi and bus drivers, admin roles that are non-governmental, construction workers who can't work remotely, so those who are working on site, so skilled trades and operatives, childcare workers, hairdressers, barbers, mechanics, butchers, deboners, and we obviously have heard much about meat processing operatives in the news, horticultural workers, care workers, and security guards. So in terms of the occupations that to date do not appear to have been impacted by COVID in terms of employment numbers would include IT professionals, scientists, engineers, business and financial, and obviously the majority of these would have the opportunity to be able to work from home. So that has helped with that. Healthcare workers, as I said, this is to do with employment numbers rather than obviously we know that healthcare workers have been particularly impacted in terms of working conditions. Education, so primary and secondary teachers. And we know that the film and TV sector has been particularly impacted, but those that have been able to work remotely, such as animators and games developers, haven't seen an impact in terms of employment numbers. So, obviously COVID is going to have a significant impact on the year ahead, but it's slightly clouding what potentially could happen with Brexit. So we've done some research with the DSP. So we're looking at the ESRI did research on the sectors that are likely to be impacted by Brexit. So we have assigned employment numbers to these. So it's not to say that everybody who's employed in these sectors are likely to be impacted, but it's just to get a sense of the type of people employed in sectors that might be impacted. And firstly, to note the 66% of people who are in the unaffected sectors, these would include the wholesale and retail sector, accommodation, food and construction. So even though they may be unaffected by Brexit, we would assume that there would be a significant COVID impact for these sectors. So this is 12% of all employment is in those sectors that are potentially severely affected. And there's a further 22% in the sectors considered moderately affected. So you can see from the chart, so these sectors include, the severely affected sectors include agriculture, financial services, and industry. So about a quarter of the people employed in industry, and relates to the manufacture of food products. So you can see the impact of people employed in these sectors in the border region is quite high, and it's low in the Dublin region. If we look at the moderately affected sectors, so these include the administrative services, ICT, professional services, and transport and logistics. And again, here, Dublin accounts for a significant share of the employment. That's with the ICT employment there particularly, whereas the border region would have one of the lowest at about 15%. So what are the type of sectors are we talking about here? So when we're talking about agriculture, we're really talking about farming of animals would be the largest subsector that we think will be impacted. And employment in the border region particularly is very high as a share of employment. Fishing, the number of people employed in fishing is quite small, but its highest numbers of employment would relate to the southwest region and the border region. When we're talking about the manufacture of food products, for most regions, it relates to meat production, which is quite high in most regions. Dairy processing is particularly significant in the southwest region. Whereas in Dublin, the number of people employed in relation to meat production is quite small. It's primarily related to both beverages, obviously with the likes of Guinnesses, etc., based in Dublin, but also bakery goods. And we know there's already been some impact with flour production and flour milling as a result of Brexit. And obviously, transport employment as a share is particularly significant for the southeast region and for the border region. But obviously this will have a significant impact across all regions. And when we look at the people employed in these sectors that are likely to be impacted, potentially impacted, it's actually the reverse of COVID-19. So you see that they're predominantly male. They're more likely to be working full-time than those in the unaffected sectors. There's a higher share who are self-employed, and this is being driven by the number of farmers. And also in terms of level of education, tends to be lower. And again, the farmers are attributing to this. The next area that we're looking at is automation risk. And we produced a report last year, The Future of Jobs in Ireland. And as COVID had begun, but we know that COVID has had an impact and is accelerating the risk of automation in some occupations. We also know that, it's not that robots are going to take everybody's jobs. The expectation is employment will continue to increase even with automation. What's likely to happen is the new jobs that are going to be created will be higher skilled, and it'll tend to be the lower skilled jobs that will be lost. But there's also going to be quite a lot of where jobs aren't lost, the tasks involved in the jobs may change, and upskilling and reskilling will be required. But you can see, if we look at the chart to the left first, you can see these are the top 6 occupational groups where there's considered a high risk of automation. But you can see that it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in these occupations will be impacted. So for operatives, there was 71,000 in the high risk, but there was a further 100,000 who were either medium or low risk. Again, with sales, a very low share really, even though it accounts for 40,000 people. So if you think of the likes of supermarkets with their checkout operators, they will have some self-service included here, administrative and secretarial, hospitality, agriculture and transport. And if we look at some of the individual occupations, what we see is there is an overlap in terms of the occupations that have been impacted by COVID. So again, you see the likes of operatives, cleaners, drivers, kitchen assistants, waiters, construction operatives, sales assistants. And we're going to see more and more of this going forward. You know, the likes of kitchen assistants, that they'll want less people in the kitchen going forward, and how they do that. And then finally, another area in terms of future skills needs would be the climate action plan. So there's three kind of areas that they're particularly looking at that will impact on skills. So the first would be the retrofitting of buildings, the heat pumps and other renewables. So the demand and the change in jobs for carpenters, electricians will evolve over the next few years. But there's also going to be an increased demand for jobs such as plasterers and painters that as an impact of retrofitting happening. In terms of offshore wind and solar power, there'd be an increased demand for wind turbine technicians. And then if we look at the rollout of the electrical vehicles, so there will be a change in the job of mechanics in terms of servicing electrical vehicles, but then also the installation of electric points in residential homes as the number of people buying electric cars increases. So despite everything that I've been saying, this is just to note that we are still seeing vacancies that are difficult to fill. We produce a recruitment agency survey each year looking at vacancies that are particularly difficult to fill. So from last year's survey, over half of the difficult to fill vacancies related to the science, engineering and technology occupations, and you can see the list there. Another quarter were in construction, so across all areas of construction, from quantity surveyors, engineers, welders, carpenters, steel erectors, even down to ground workers. And then 9% in transport and storage. So between drivers, forklift drivers, freight forwarders, and custom clearance staff, which we would imagine would be particularly important considering Brexit. So just to kind of summarize some of the key challenges, obviously in terms of education training provision, we would see upskilling and reskilling needs being massive over the next year. So we would see, you know, even ourselves, as you know, we've all been upskilling by trying to adapt to the remote working life. But we will also see those who are trying to re-enter jobs that they have left behind may have changed, you know, increased health and safety, cleaning, other areas, but also those who were potentially looking at moving to a different occupation and what upskilling and reskilling needs. Again, with the likes of the increase in automation, we're going to see jobs changing, and again, upskilling and reskilling needs there. What will the impacts of Brexit be and climate action, and how we source skills? So we're definitely going to see an issue of people not being able to recruit despite the high number of people likely to be unemployed. There may not be a direct link. You know, people who've lost jobs, the sales assistants may not want to directly go into care working roles, or to work as IT programmers. So how we look at how to bridge that gap. And we also know that there's over 110,000 people who have been claiming PUP since the beginning. So that's over a year. So how we encourage these people to return to education training, and how we encourage them back into the labour market will be a challenge ahead. So that is the summary of the national picture. I'm going to now pass over to Nina, who's going to take you through the regional element of today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joan. I'm just gonna. Thanks, Joan. So I'm going to talk us through the regional element to the presentation today. So I'm just going to look at the regional infographics and the regional data that we produce in the Skills and Labour Market Research Unit, which we provide this data through the infographics, and it gives a snapshot of what's going on in each region. I suppose the purpose of running through the infographics for you today is to give a flavour of the type of data that we can produce within our unit. And the data and the information that is presented is obviously static. The majority of the data is based on the third quarter of 2020. But in presenting and showing you the data today, it shows you what we can produce and the type of data that we can provide in supporting requests that we may have, and in showing you the data and in the infographics, it shows you that we can provide this kind of data in a timely and up-to-date manner. So how are the regions divided, and how do we come up with 8 regions? So in Ireland, it's divided into 8 regions. As you can see there, the Border, the West, the Midwest, the Southeast, the Southwest, Dublin, Mideast, and the Midlands. So this is based on the NUTS 3 variable, which the Central Statistics Office used to collect regional data. So within those 8 regions, there are counties attributed. So for instance, their Border, you can see that Donegal, Sligo, Leitrim, Cavan and Monaghan are there. For instance, in the Southeast region, the counties there are Waterford, Kilkenny, Carlow and Wexford. And in the Midlands, it's Longford, Westmeath and Offaly and Laois. So in producing 8 regional infographics, I suppose we aim to highlight and focus our data across a number of areas in the SLMRU, such as employment, employment by sector, unemployment and job announcement data. This year, when we produced the infographics, we added a number of new sections, including the impact of COVID-19 and also pandemic unemployment data, because it's important for us in the unit to ensure that our data, particularly the region infographic, is reflective of the current economic climate. So we added those to a number of new sections to the infographics. And so where do we collect the data from? So we collect it from a number of different sources. For instance, the employment, unemployment and the pandemic unemployment data is collected from the Central Statistics Office. We collect the sector focused data from Compass Ireland, and the job announcement data is collected in-house within our unit through a number of media analysis sources. So just before running through the data in the infographic, I wanted to show you a flavour of what's actually going on in the different regions in Ireland between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020. So as you can see there, the change in employment for Dublin was greatest at 4.4% between 2019 and 2020. Overall, you can see the change in a decrease in employment in the state and overall by 2.3%. And if you look at the bottom there of the graph in the Midlands, between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020, the Midlands observed an increase in employment of 4.4%. When we delve into this, we can attribute some of the increase in employment for this time period to public sector employment. So I've taken this snapshot directly from the infographic to kind of show you a visual of what we actually produce in the infographics. So on each regional infographic, we begin by looking at employment by sector. So I've taken these directly from the infographic. On the left here, we have data from Dublin, and on the right here, we have data from the Southeast region. The data is based on the third quarter of 2020. So as you can see there for Dublin, I'll talk us through Dublin. Dublin accounted for 30.2% of employment in the state for the third quarter of 2020. We look at then the top 5 sectors in each region in terms of employment. So for Dublin, you'll see that health is the largest employer, followed by wholesale and retail. Then when we move on from the top 5 sectors, we look at the total of employed persons in each of those 5 sectors. And then we do a commentary on the changes in employment between the first and the third quarter of 2020. And the same data, as you can see on the right there, is produced for the Southeast and right throughout each of the infographics across each region. Obviously, the regions differ quite considerably. So I've said this is a new part of the infographic that we decided to put in this year. Again, ensuring that the data is timely and reflective of the economic climate that we're currently in. So in this section of each region, we begin by looking at overall employment. Then we look at the employment by gender, we give a sector focus, and then we look at the workforce in terms of the participation rate. So I've presented data on the Mideast and the South and the Southwest here. Again, it's an exact screenshot from the infographic just to give you a visual. In terms of the Mideast, you can see that employment fell by 1,700 people. Females experienced a greater decrease in employment when we compare them to their male counterparts. We see the labour force participation rate increased in this region, while wholesale and retail sector observed a decline. However, industry observed an increase in terms of employment. So similar data again is presented on the right for the Southwest region, and right throughout each of the infographics we've discussed an impact of COVID-19 on each region. So sector focus. So we get this data from Compass Ireland. So the sector focus gives us The sector focus gives us an insight into the top manufacturing companies in each region. So I've presented the West and the Southwest here. It's just to give a flavour of the types of companies that are in each region. So as you can see there for the West, the top manufacturers are Car Provision, Ballina Beverages, and for the Southwest region on the bottom there, we can see that Eli Lilly and Stryker Orthopedics are some of the top manufacturing regions or companies in the Southwest region. So here we have some data on the pandemic unemployment payments, and this data is for February 2021. And it shows the share across all regions, the share of those in receipt of payments across all regions are actually in line with the share of employment for each region. So as we can see here for the Mideast accounted for 15% of total employment in the fourth quarter of 2020, which is similar in terms of pandemic unemployment payments. And when we look at the border region accounted for 4% of total employment for the same time period. And we look at the share of pandemic unemployment payments, these are the same. So it's just to give you a flavour of where the share of pandemic unemployment payments by region. So this is a snapshot of the data that we produce in the infographic. And again, it's a new section which we added, obviously it's a new data source that we added to the infographics this year, and it's based off week 44 of 2020. So I've used Dublin as the example for the pandemic unemployment payments here. So in this section, we present the number of people in receipt of a payment and their share of the labour force. We give an age breakdown. We also give a breakdown by gender as well of those in receipt of a payment. And again, we produce this across each of the 8 regions, and it's sometimes good to be able to compare payments with other regions. So here we have unemployment rates in the fourth quarter of 2020. The overall unemployment rate, as we see there for the state in the fourth quarter of 2020, was 5.7%. The Midwest had the highest unemployment rate. Well, if we look to the end of the graph, the West had the lowest unemployment rate. However, as Joan has actually previously mentioned, it is really important to note that unemployment rates may not actually be giving a clear picture of what is going on at the moment, as people are actually in receipt of pandemic unemployment payments. So the true unemployment rate could actually be as high as 20%. Here we have the unemployment data that we produce in the infographics. And this just gives you a visual of what we actually present in the infographic. So on the left here, I've pulled a snapshot of the time series of unemployment data for the Midlands region. And on the right, it's the commentary that we give on the border region. So for the time series, as you can see there for the Midland region, we've gone back to 2012. And you can see that the unemployment rate in the Midland region since 2012 has been consistently higher than that of the unemployment rate at a national level. However, if we go to the end of the graph, we can see that the unemployment rate for the third quarter of 2020 is in fact lower than that at a national level. For each region, again, on the right, if we look, I've taken the border region data. We go through a commentary on unemployment statistics in the region. We go through the numbers of persons unemployed. Then we go through the change between the first and the third quarter of 2020. We then produce the unemployment rate for each region and the change again between the first and the third quarter of 2020. Again, it's just to give you an idea of what's going on in terms of unemployment in each region. So job announcement data. So as I said, we collect this data in-house through media analysis, and it's just to give you a flavour of what's actually going on and the type of companies that are advertising for jobs in each region. I've presented a snapshot from the infographic. You can see at the top there, the Dublin region, in the middle it's the Midwest region, and at the bottom there it's the Southwest region. So it's just to give you a flavour of the types of companies that are advertising jobs in each region. These are the 8 infographics, again, colour coordinated. Across each one, and this is just to give you a visual of what we produce. So where are these available? So all of our regional data through the infographics are available on the SOLAS website. So it's www.solas.ie, and it's a 2-click process. So you go to research and then regional skills, and the map itself on the right is interactive. So you can just click on the region that you require the infographic data from. And just to state, we are available to assist in the data needs. As I said, the infographics themselves do date. The data is static. However, we are able to produce timely data. And I thought that's the idea of the infographic today in the presentation, just to give you a flavour of what we actually can produce in the unit. So our emails are there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Joan and Nina. Very interesting information. And we will open the floor now to the questions. The first question we have that came in through chat is actually relevant to Nina's presentation, and this is with regards to the different regions. So you have outlined 8 different regions. However, ETBs might not be covering exactly the regions as they're outlined in your presentation. And can data be amended to incorporate ETB region specific?
Obviously, yeah, the data is aligned to the way the CSO collect the data in regard to the NUTS3 variable. County level data, I suppose, is really only available at a census level. That's basically where, so if we were to break it down, we would use census data to break the data down at a county level.
I'll jump in just because I saw that question coming in, so I had a little bit of time to think about it. Where we can produce county level data, we do. We have other sources like the business demography, live register, Nina would look at as well. So those, wherever we have county information, we do provide it. The issue is employment data, apart from, as Nina mentioned, the census. All employment data from the Labour Force Survey is based on those regions. We don't get that at county level, so we can't break it down any more than the regions already. But wherever we have data at county level, we can shape that. And as Nina said, we can kind of assign kind of shares based on the census data, which will give some sort of reflection of employment in the areas that you're looking at.
Thank you very much, John, for clarification, and thank you, Nina. If you have a question, please use raise the hand facility on your screen, and just to make sure that you unmute yourself when it's time to speak.
Just while to give everybody a chance to think of questions, I mean, I think we've probably painted a slightly, hopefully it's not as bleak as a picture, you know, that we did see over the year when restrictions eased, there was recovery, you know, happening, particularly in wholesale and retail and in accommodation food. So we do see opportunities continuing once restrictions are eased.
Thank you, John. You probably can see the question coming in, and there.
Yeah,
next one is how to use geolocation.
So in relation to PLSS, we aren't working directly with the PLSS, so I don't know. I do know that they have been doing some work on the geocoding, but I don't know what level, what stage it's at the moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, so at the moment we have no, oh, there's another question coming in. Of those on PUP could remain on the payment, it would encourage take up of reskilling. There is always the fear of payment reduction when moving across to the course. So I suppose it's more of a comment rather than a question.
Yeah, and as I said, there's 110,000 people who have been on the pandemic unemployment now for a full year. You know, there's a real sense that we need to figure out who these people are and how we get them kind of reskilled and ready when things reopen, because, you know, obviously they didn't return to employment when the restrictions eased. So how do we kind of assist those people to get them back into employment?
Okay. I don't think we have any hands which are raised at the moment, John and Nina. But I would like to just express to everyone that if you have any follow-up questions after the session, they probably can be accommodated. So if you send me an email, and I will get in touch with John and Nina to get clarification if you have any questions after that. And then the presentations will be available, and you will be able to send. You will be able to receive a link to the presentations and also to the recorded session, and recorded session will be available on Digital Library website. I think there is just one more notice after coming in. One significant problem for ECBs is that case officers are involved in PUP payment and not in activation. Yes, so it's both comment with regards to the system. Okay, there's a question here. Are those that have not come back to work not back due to illness?
No, because there's a different payment for those who are on COVID payments because of illness rather than it's that something hasn't reopened. So as I said, the likes of cleaners, you know, if the businesses haven't reopened, they haven't been able to go back to work. And there's certain, you know, pubs didn't get to reopen for very long. There was issues with I think with certain businesses that haven't been able to reopen for the last year. So that would be the main reason why they haven't been able to go back.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have answered all of the questions that we have, and I would like to thank on behalf of ETBI, Joanne and Nina for giving presentation. Thank you so much, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you have any questions after the presentation, please send me an email. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.